Welcome to the Adam and Sheridan Show,
where today we're continuing our discussion of labor history.
That's right. We dealt with last podcast the strikes in 1886 and 1893, and today we're going to be fast forwarding all the way to the year 1934.
Capitalist communism is social ownership.
We have here today Mr. David Streichenrebel, head.
Actually, the name is David Streichenrebel.
David Streichenrebel.
It's German.
Appropriate, who is head of a cooperative organization here in town.
Actually, I'm not the head of the organization. There are no heads. It's more of a body kind of thing.
We have Mr. David Streichenrebel from a cooperative here in town. So, Mr. Streichenrebel, David. So, David, what was your position again?
Cooperative co-owner.
And so you don't run the organization?
No one runs the organization. It's cooperatively run. All of us run it together and make decisions together.
So you share your responsibility with all the employees?
No. I'm
not following.
Look, it's called a cooperative because all employees cooperatively own and manage the company.
Is it profitable?
Oh yes, very, very profitable. And not only that, but we have the ability to determine democratically as workers where those profits go. If we want to reinvest it in machinery, if we want to give bonuses at Christmas time, or any other thing that we decide to do with it, we decide, and not the executives at the top, because there are none.
So how does this unique form of organization work out?
Well,
there you have it. My conversation with a fringe lunatic prone to outbursts of anger. When you're out there tonight, stay safe.
Well, that was the demonstration of the media and how they deal with anything that's politically different whatsoever. The idea of cooperatives and workers owning the place that they work at. That's somehow a bizarre notion to a lot of media outlets.
It is, and you'll notice we're in a completely different place. We're very echoey because we are actually in the third on third gallery. We're sitting here in front of Steve Lafreniere's piece, which is incredible.
Yes, it's Native American based here.
Yeah.
His piece is, and as we showed you earlier with some of the images around, he has the large Indian smoking a peace pipe, and I can use the term peace pipe, right?
No.
No.
So we no, but I mean this is a gorgeous place and absolutely, wonderful art. It's just incredible. So we hope you enjoyed some of that was flashing in the screen.
And that's located on the third on third gallery in the Arts Council third floor.
Yep. We got special permission from Dennis Drew to film here, so thank you very much. But we're sitting down because of what my co-host is going to talk about in just a second, the Flint sit-down strikes in 1997, I believe I'm right in saying.
Oh, if only. if only the rights of workers had gone that long, not achieved.
Yeah.
No, this was actually 1936. Going into the first 2.5 months of 1937.
Yeah.
What the Flint sit-down strikes were, if you can imagine a time when there was no unionization in the auto industry, and actually in most
sectors of the workplace.
It's really amazing to think, because nowadays we hate on unions. It's just, and even you and I do. Now, in terms of Flint, Michigan, that's where General Motors had numerous plants. car plants, and the conditions were miserable. I mean, we're talking 12-hour days. We're talking the heat was just unimaginable in the summertime, and the cold was unimaginable in the wintertime. There were no breaks allowed, no bathroom breaks. I mean, everything that we take for granted today. I remember when I worked at the Connection, it was a big deal when the air was a little bit dusty and people were coughing, you know, and we needed to get the ventilation fixed. I'm not denigrating that, but I'm just saying that at the time, if you worked in a General Motors plant, chances are you were inhaling more dust than oxygen.
Yeah.
So workers eventually couldn't take this,
Yeah.
and they said we need to do something about it. And what had happened earlier, a year earlier, as a matter of fact, in France, is the idea of the sit-down strike. Now, back in the 1800s, there was rioting in the streets, and there was picketing and so forth. Well, what they did in France was they said, well, let's take the fight from outside of the factory to the inside of the factory, and let's just occupy it. Let's just say we're not leaving and we're not working until management sits down and negotiates with us.
Was this organized by radical labor leaders, or was it initiated by the workers themselves?
Well, at the time there was a UAW a year prior to the Flint sit-down strikes, and it was very small. And a lot of these smaller locals were filled with socialists, and they were filled with radical labor leaders. And so when the Flint sit-down strikes began, the main objective was to get the shops to become unionized, to get General Motors and other factories
incorporated into the UAW.
Right, exactly, and to expand it. And when we talk about a sit-down strike, what we really mean is that these workers are living inside of the factory. It's not like you occupy it during the work hours and you go home to your wife. These workers literally lived inside the General Motors plants from December 30th, 1936, all the way until February 11th, 1937. That's over 6 weeks.
Yeah.
They didn't always have food. They didn't always have running water. At one point, management turned off the heat. And this was, you know, obviously in the dead of winter in Michigan. So they were very cold. What really got me was the solidarity with other workers. There were some bakers, some female bakers in the area who brought the workers dinner for free because they supported them. They supported the right of workers to at least have good, decent working conditions, to be safe. This is before OSHA. Even though the workers were unarmed, they were bombarded with tear gas. They were bombarded with actual bullets. 12 people were injured, not killed, but injured. And that forced the workers in there to respond. And they were literally taking rubber hoses as slingshots and door handles and using that as weapons and firing on at the cops to defend themselves. And FDR thankfully called off the National Guard. They were coming in with bayonets, and he called that off. But it took, like I said, it took 6 weeks for repeated attempts to get these workers out. It didn't work. They said, no, we're not going anywhere. It's not worth it to us to stop this, to go back to the hell that was the working conditions of the GM plants. And finally, after 6 weeks, they finally got to sit down with GM, and not only did that plant become unionized, but all of the car companies' plants became unionized. We're talking about 250,000 people in the UAW by the end of 1937. So that was Flint, but actually 2 years earlier was the Minneapolis, Minnesota Teamsters strike, which I know nothing about, and I'm eager to hear Sheridan's report on that.
Okay, in the 1920s, and I'm reading some of this because I can't memorize it, but Minneapolis was an extremely anti-union city. In fact, a lot of the leaders of the city had an open workplace drive, which basically meant you do not have unions, which is the same as a right to work state. So it's saying you know it basically says you shouldn't belong to a union. You should just work without collective organization. At this time, this was an extremely rancorous thing. That happened in the 20s, and then the market crashed in the 30s. So of course, you know, this drove wages down, hours up, because they didn't want to hire more people because there was a larger reserve labor.
Similar thing happened with the UAW with the Flint strike. That was an open shop there, and they were agitating for a union.
They weren't really agitating for a union. They were agitating, well, they were agitating to become a union.
The truck drivers?
The truck drivers.
Okay.
And the drivers, because sometimes they would start work at 2 or 3 in the morning, and then they would get home at 6.
So this is a
It's a
Teamsters
long
general
day.
strike then?
No.
No.
No, what's interesting about that, okay. So Carl Skoglund is who I was reading mostly, this Wikipedia and another source, which I can't remember who wrote it, but it was a contemporary source. But Carl Skoglund was among the leaders of this strike. He wasn't associated with any union. He was a member of the Communist Party of America, who then was kicked out for his anti-Stalinist views. And then formed the Socialist Workers' Party, a staunchly Trotskyist party at that point. So he was in Minneapolis, and he was agitating for this general strike. So
now, what is a general strike?
the general
How does it
strike
differ
is
from a
just-
regular one?
So this is across all areas. They were trying to shut down Minneapolis, and in a lot of ways they succeeded. But they petitioned the Teamsters for assistance and for their sanctioning, and there were strikers' benefits that the Teamsters had set up. Funny thing though, the Teamsters were a conservative union. They didn't believe in strikes, and they said, no, just continue negotiating, and you'll get what you want eventually, maybe, kind of, sort of. So
Let's see how well that works out.
yeah. And essentially, so the Teamsters were saying no, and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters also did not represent them. What you were seeing is this group of workers, along with a few organizers from this Trotskyist party, that were just organizing themselves. They were going up and saying, we're going to start this general strike. And I think it started on May 16th. So this, at this point, it became the common thing to do. Again, I talked about it last show. They mobilized the police, and they deputized every anti-worker citizen they could find. They said, here's a gun, you're now part of law enforcement. And so
to control all of these workers, and you said all of Minneapolis, that's all of the industries in Minneapolis, not just one specific sector of work. It's whether you're a car worker or a baker or a candlestick maker, you're going on strike.
Yeah, and this had come after lots and lots of negotiation, lots and lots of trying to ask unions for help in bargaining, but they didn't. The Teamsters said, the drivers know where we are, come get us. So what they did was they went to the inside workers of the factories, the outside workers, loaders and stuff like that. And then the drivers were the main driving force, and they said, you know what, we are all looking for representation. So we're going to create this general union, this general strike, so that we can represent and bargain for the wages of everybody.
That's a great idea, and that rarely happens. If you have a general strike going on, you've got a potential revolutionary moment. Because how often does every worker from across industry come together and say, we all want to have a representative union for all of us?
And especially because it was illegal. It is illegal.
Oh, it's illegal to do that.
Yes, it's illegal to do a general strike.
That's reactionary.
It is. It's completely reactionary, even though Portland just did it 2 years ago, I think.
Good for them,
Covered it on the show.
whoever they are.
Yeah, but they shut down the port. It was a general strike.
Oh, the longshoremen.
The longshoremen.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
We did cover that on the radio show.
But so essentially, this strike was met with force at the beginning. It was muted force, so they had batons and clubs and stuff. But what was happening was, because there were a lot of deputized citizens, they would lure like a group of women into an alley and beat them to try and dishearten people. Now this was
The police did this.
the police and the deputized citizens.
Okay.
So I think it was the deputized citizens that were luring people to beat them. But whenever they stopped a delivery, which happened quite often, they would try and stop deliveries. They would be beaten. The strikers were largely unarmed, and they were trying to be peaceful. There were some people who did arm themselves, but the leaders of the strike said, no, this is going to increase the violence used against us, because there were beatings, but there were not shootings up to that point. And they were letting some deliveries through. Any delivery to a hospital, any delivery to an old folks home, anything like that, Any delivery to people who needed it was let through without problems. But what the police started doing at this point is they started having fake deliveries and real deliveries that were outside what the strikers were prepared to allow. So, but they would do this with 40 deputies with shotguns, just to instigate something so they could start shooting. So there was a delivery
A familiar tactic.
But here on July 20th, there was a small delivery made under guard of 40 armed deputies. The strikers at this point, because there had been skirmishes, were armed with clubs. They overtook the truck, and there were some of them that overtook the truck. And then the deputies started firing on them. And then strikers came over to see why there was gunfire, and the deputies turned on the people who had not been involved in this incident and started firing on them. So this was, you know, at the end of this, there were 2 dead, 67 wounded.
Wow.
And this was shotguns that were just spraying.
And how did the public react to this?
The public was on strike. They were either on strike or invalid.
So everyone took a side, is what you're saying?
More often than not. Yeah, you were on the side of the police and the owners, or you were on the side of the strikers. But the media, yeah, they were on the side of the owners. So they actually put together their own periodical. And again,
well, the Socialist Workers' Party had the militant, I believe, at this time.
They did have the militant,
So
but
were
they
they
put together
publishing?
their own pamphlets.
Okay, they
no,
did, all right.
It was completely separate. It was just for the Minneapolis strikers.
Okay.
So they put together their own periodicals. They were telling their own stories. And at some point, this was a little before the July 20th battle, but General Floyd B. Olson had negotiated a 48-hour ceasefire so that the government could act as an intermediary to stop the violence, which had happened at this point, but to stop the violence and to close the strike. And they actually did it. They got the workers and the employers to agree. And what they agreed upon was that the workers would be made a union, and that union would be understood to represent not just the drivers, not just the outside workers, but the inside factory workers as well. In fact, most workers in the city were going to be represented by this union. And so that was fine. The strike was called off, and everybody was happy until when they started to negotiate. The owners said, "Sorry, we didn't mean it. You can only represent the drivers." And so the strike resumed immediately.
Now, I don't know as much as you do about this, but I'm guessing that here again there was a problem with leadership, because I'm wondering if the leaders who were sitting down and negotiating with management, if they had something to do with that. If they
Not at all.
Not at all?
No, because this was one of the people who was in the room giving this reflection.
So then what happened at that point?
So they did go on strike. They went right back on strike. They you know, and that's when the battles started heating up, because they started arming the police with guns. Some of the strikers were armed with clubs, and it became kind of a street fight at that point.
Kind of like what we're seeing in Ukraine today, only for different reasons.
Yes, but eventually the Army Reserves were called in. They surrounded the strikers with machine guns and put the leaders in the, quote, stockade.
Wow.
The government, then mediation took place, and a settlement was reached on August 21st. But most of the leaders, so that the union that had formed tried to get secondary leaders, which they were easily found, but they got secondary leaders, not the people who had been negotiating before. They were all locked up. But on August 21st, they acquiesced to most of the demands, and finally the strike was over. But of course, it didn't work too awfully well. But the funny thing is,
They got their union, though, right? Is that what you're saying?
they got their union. They got representation of a large swath of workers, inside and outside workers and drivers. But Carl Skoglund and many other leaders of this union and many other socialists were imprisoned in 1941 by the Smith Act. And in fact,
What was that?
the Smith Act was an anti-radical act. So if you had radical politics, you could be imprisoned or questioned or in fact deported. And in the 1950s, there were deportation orders on Carl Skoglund until he died in 1960. So, you know, he was kind of politically hounded after this. So 1934 to 1941, he was politically active. He was head of the union. He was, you know, he was doing all this stuff, but he was then imprisoned. You know, it was basically
So
like,
it
we
was
don't
a
like
mix.
your politics, we're going to throw you and 11 other people in prison. We're going to deport even more.
So it was definitely a mixed result.
Well,
But there were lessons there, which we'll talk about in a moment.
And I honestly think, like, to us today, it's kind of a shockingly short-sighted goal. It's something where, you know, we would think you would go for cooperative management or owning the means of production. You know, that happened when a factory was going to close down by, I think, window manufacturers. They occupied the factory and then worked out an agreement where they could buy the factory in installments at a very low price, buy the factory, and they operate it cooperatively to this day even. So it seems like short-sighted demands, but cooperative management would have been an interesting demand to see back in the early 20th century.
So that is a rundown on two very important events in 20th century labor history, the Minneapolis, Minnesota general strike, and also the Flint sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan.
So you share your responsibility with all the employees.
Yes.
That was a great take. Okay, we'll go from the take.
Was that correct?
No.
Was that a correct answer?
No, you share your
No, I
responsibility
should have said
with your
no.
employees, yes.
Well, thank you for watching the latest Adam and Sheridan Show video podcast. I hope we weren't too long-winded or pompous in our presentations.
I hope we weren't also too funny, causing urine to expel quickly from your bladder.
Does it? Well, but specifically your urethra. Anyway, so basically, before we go, we just wanted to run two things by you.
Yeah.
Number one is these aren't just museum pieces here. These aren't just historical lessons.
These are music.
These are museum pieces. No, but these are things that in the coming struggles we can learn from these experiences.
Yeah.
The general strike, the idea of involving all workers in every industry. Like they always say, the working class's biggest strength is in its numbers. And two, the sit-down strike. You know, why should the means of production be owned by one worker or by one capitalist? They should be owned in common, and you should sit down and show that and
also
fight for your rights.
And also what's effective, you know, sitting down in the factory so it can no longer be worked by scabs is an important thing. But you know, just generally seeing the relation, you know, what I focused on is the relationship between capital and labor, which was oftentimes a relationship that was, the distance was spanned by bullets, you know?
Yeah,
it was,
unfortunately.
Yeah, but you know, it's something to look at, it's something to understand, and it's something obviously to talk about further. So if you have any questions or you have any strikes that you think were mentioned, email us, AdamandSheridanShow
AdamandSheridanShow@gmail.com. Also, next podcast, we're going to be wrapping up our labor series with the 21st century and the Occupy Wall Street movement. In the meantime, you can see us, catch up with us on the Adam and Sheridan Show Facebook page. Also, check out our radio show Fridays at 6 p.m., Sunday mornings at 11 at 107.9 WRFA-LP FM and also WRFA-LP.com if you want to stream it as theirs.
If you want to hear old shows, WRFA-LP, SoundCloud page, which will be showing up here. I don't have it memorized, but we have over 4 years of shows.
I don't know how far back it goes. I think it goes back to like episode 50.
Oh, well,
But
close.
still, that's more than enough and you're going to need.
But check out our shows on SoundCloud if you don't live in the Jamestown area, and also check us out on Twitter. Every now and again, tweet at us.
In the meantime, my name is Adam Courtwright.
My name is Sheridan. Stay active.
I wish I had some pad right here. My fucking, I'll just do this. I don't know what I'm doing here. There.
It's,
You know what I mean? Like you have your shoes on.
well, yes, but let me demonstrate something here.
Yes, please do.
This is what meditation has allowed me to be able to do.
But this isn't how they sat. Like, can you just imagine the Flint workers sitting around? Oh,
Flint workers are like, let's have a sit-in strike.
Om.